The climate change, extreme weather events begin to dominate our discourse. Disasters started happening more frequently in terms of urban flooding and seawater intrusion, glacial melt. It's not possible for us to have climate solutions without having solutions about poverty. In just about every month, you will read in the papers that the school will close today because of air pollution. The climate crisis, triggered by the lifestyle of the Western countries, refuses to accept the responsibility. How do we deliver climate-related awareness and education to youth and to children? There are opportunities for the private sector to deliver climate-smart projects.
Welcome everyone to MT Out Loud, जहां बस बात कर दो। My name is Alia Agha, and today's episode is something that is affecting each one of us on this planet. You guessed it right. It is the climate change clock, and that is kicking. So, who is responsible? In this episode of MT Out Loud, we are in conversation with an expert and an authority on climate change. He's been a teacher of many environmentalists in Pakistan and abroad, and my mentor. I welcome Ali Tauqi Sheikh.
Pleasure.
What has been Pakistan's climate change history?
Pakistan's climate history is history of underdevelopment of Pakistan. The interface between climate change and poverty is very strong. And poverty stems out of inequitable investments that we make in different sectors, between rural areas and urban areas and between different sectors. The less we invest in people and less we invest in their institutions, more vulnerable they become. And when the extreme weather events happen, those vulnerable people, those poor people, are the first line of victims. This typically involves women, children, elderly, people in fragile ecosystems, and those who are living in destitute, such as in the coastal areas, such as in the high altitude mountains, such as next to the glaciers, such as people living next to the water bodies. Most of our cities are urban sprawls. It's very hard to call them cities. It's urban sprawl. And most of the sprawl is in low-lying areas. These are the people who do not have municipal services. No road, no public transportation, typically no parks, no hospitals, no schools. And whenever there is a rain or a heat wave, they are the victims. We don't even get the data about their misery. So that is the history of climate change in Pakistan. It began even before partition. We didn't know much about climate change at that time. But Pakistan was primarily comprised of rural areas that were underdeveloped areas, the poorer areas of this subcontinent. It was Sindh, it was Balochistan, it was Punjab, it was Bengal. We were poor, agrarian. Our nutrition level, education level, life expectancy, everything was very small. And then we came under military dictatorship, we had Ayub Khan. That is where we started investing in big business through permits, through backdoor. So we started a path of inequitable development. We created families that were very rich. And we created a system whereby poverty or disparity between classes was not seen as too bad. It has been growing since. So this was the second stage. And then the third stage came when we began to Islamize. Yes, there was a process of nationalization also under Bhutto. But for my purposes, I'm still moving to the purposes of time.
Yeah, this is interesting because I don't know how this would be related. Okay.
And when it came to Islamization, we hijacked the discourse on development. We made it a faith-oriented conversation. So it was far more important for us, we are eating with right hand or left hand, whether or not we are wearing a chadar on the TV screen or not, than to say what is the skill set you have. Then saying that what are the textbooks that you're studying in your schools. And then came General Musharraf's time. That is the time when for the first time housing societies such as DHA were legalized. So the urban sprawl then had a context that polarizes this society further. Those disparities meant that this structured city, formal city, was much smaller, maybe 30%, maybe 40% of the total population. And most of the population was informal settlements, Kachi Abadis. And there was not much that we could do about them. Health, education, parks, and things that I mentioned. And we institutionalized that. It was very fashionable for us to have tents. If they were on the road to the airport, we'll have a tent when a VIP is visiting us, hiding them. We were not hiding them. We were hiding our ugly face. We didn't want to face this reality of disparity. And by this time, the climate change, extreme weather events begin to dominate our discourse. As after the earthquake, disasters started happening more frequently in terms of urban flooding, in terms of seawater intrusion, glacial melt, flooding. And then we said it's climate change. We did not recognize that climate change is only a threat multiplier. It's exploiting the vulnerabilities or divides that exist in this society. It's not creating its own dichotomies. It's just exploiting. And that's why it's mostly the poor and the vulnerable or the victim of climate change. So the link between poverty and climate change is very important for us to understand. I'll try to give you a background. They are two sides of the same coin. And two most important challenges of this century is increasing poverty and increasing climate vulnerability. And we cannot win one battle without winning the other. It's not possible for us to have climate solutions without having solutions about poverty. And that's why I said these are two sides of the same coin.
How is education playing a role in this as well? Because you talked about the curriculum. So I'd be quite interested to see how did we change the curriculum and what is it that we have excluded and not including at this point also when climate emergency has literally been declared all over the world.
The interface with climate is at least, between climate and education, is at least at 4 levels. The first level that is oftentimes ignored is how many school days are wasted because of heat waves and floods. Schools are used as shelters.
You know, we used to pray when we were young. We used to actually pray कि school बंद हो जाए.
Precisely. But now you see, in just about every month, you will read in the papers that the school will close today because of, air pollution. And that's the first, where the delivery of education is getting interrupted so very frequently, and we are not even maintaining data. Second interface with education is how do we deliver climate-related awareness and education to youth and to children. That means we need to educate them from early on in the schooling what are the climate change related issues in their daily lives that they need to be exposed to, taught about. And our curricula is still very stagnant. It has not been revised.
Why is it so? Is it because there are not enough experts who contribute towards that? Or
awareness within the ministries and departments of education is extremely limited. Curriculum revision is an extremely difficult process in Pakistan. It takes 7 to 9 years to revise curriculum. Having a better teacher is a lot easier in our experience than having a better book. And better teacher is not possible to get because the compensation level is not good enough. And when young girls and boys come to private schools for education, it's only a temporary phase in their lives that they get married or they get their CSS exams or admission in masters, and then they leave. So typically, we have held education relegated to the secondary level of importance in our real life. So we are not giving trained teacher in our education system. And the government system schools are basically focusing on rote.
Since we are discussing climate history, are you pro or against 18th Amendment?
There's no question of pro or against. In the climate change context or in the context of development, I already told you that this is flip side of the same coin. For me, these are issues intrinsically linked. Vulnerability is always a local issue. It requires bottom-up responses. It has to give ownership to the people and to the communities to decide about their. Sitting in Islamabad, I will not know what people in Hyderabad need. I know that every railway bazaar in every town and village of Punjab or Sindh will have a drainage and then the shops. And drainage is a flood drain. I know sitting in Islamabad only how to widen the road. I don't know how to protect that drainage system. Only local government will do that. Because they know if it is blocked, then the city is choked or the town is choked. So 18th Amendment is a process that has empowered local level communities to an extent. And the starting point was strengthening the provincial governments.
Right.
So the process is not complete. You have not reached to the third level of governance. There are 3 tiers of governance: federal, provincial, and local. And local government is extremely politicized in this country. It has not been rooted the way it has been rooted in other countries and societies. And therefore, they have no capacities and competencies to impose taxes, revenues, octroys, develop their own priorities, define their own budget, understand and develop human resources that they need. And therefore, most of the development in the country is top-down. And no wonder it fades.
Yes.
We say Pakistan is a graveyard of policies. May be true, but these policies were not developed by communities. These were not developed by local governments. These are developed by experts, interest experts, foundation experts, who are light years removed from realities. So in the climate change context, vulnerability is always a local issue. The response has to be local. And the cost of action is much smaller than the cost of inaction. The cost of inaction is increasing the cost of development. And same thing that costs you 500 rupees will cost you maybe many times more if it is stopped on. So we have to understand that the solution to Pakistan's climate change disasters and losses, we say $30 billion we lost in 2022 floods. But the solution is developing local responses, pursuing locally led development, developing local adaptation plans of action, and then empowering communities and local girls and boys to take charge of their lives.
That sounds very idealistic. But what I understand is that there is hardly any synergetic coordination. So who is responsible? Is it the government? Is it the private sector? Is it the youth or the civil society? Who is really responsible?
Not allowing the local governments to flourish in or consolidate in Pakistan is a reflection of elite capture. Our structure is upside down. It has to be reversed. There has to be a constitutional protection to local government. The resources have to be transferred to them. NFC award goes insofar as the provincial capitals are concerned. It never travels from provincial capitals to district levels and from district to tehsil and taluka levels. So we have to find a way of transferring resources there. And once we begin to transfer the resources, we'll know the money will attract talent also. I'll be happy to serve a government in remote areas of Balochistan and Sindh if I can be adequately compensated. If my job in terms of reference is challenging and rewarding for me at professionally and a personal, why not? But we have created a barren land there to serve anyone. And it has a very serious implication. Allow me to mention that here.
Sure.
The interest of finance that we get, we are unable to spend because we do not trust the transfer of those resources to provinces and from provinces to local governments. We want to spend it all and we don't have that absorptive capacity. No wonder most of international finance and international assistance stays underspent. It faces delayed spending. It faces throw forward in spending projects. Every project is a delayed project. And every time there is a delay, there is a cost escalation. if you're not investing in the spending capacity at the district and tehsil level, this will be a vicious cycle that will not be able to spend the money that we have.
Well, very interesting, because you mentioned that there's this sort of elitism when we go towards governance. And I would say there's this elitism prevailing even for concepts, just like the Climate Investment Fund. Could you just break it down for people just like us? What is Climate Investment Fund? Who raises this money? And how does it get trickled down to a country like Pakistan, and on what grounds?
The term used is international climate finance. It comes from the assumption that the climate crisis is triggered by the lifestyle of the West countries, and they have an obligation to support the victim countries like Pakistan, who have not emitted as many carbon pollution in the atmosphere. So, in other words, the expectation is that there is sufficient fund globally available for poorer countries to access that finance to offset some of the costs of climate change, such as pollution.
Who gives this fund?
Developed countries, so to speak. Now, it's far more complex. This is the summary of this. And there's a complexity, and each fact is very contested fact. So whatever I say, it'll be a counter-argument, but let me try to explain to you that. If we say that the West is responsible, West refuses to accept the responsibility. Because if you accept the responsibility, then there can be lawsuits. Then there can be obligations. And they do not simply want to deal with lawsuits and obligations. They want to keep it as a voluntary level. They say, yes, we may have caused historically, but then we did not at the time. But you're so poor, your needs are so desperate. Here is a small contribution from our side. So it's a voluntary contribution from their side. They do not accept the word compensation. Let's come to this. Second, when they give a voluntary check, this is a trade-off. They have aging populations, and economies are not growing at a huge rate, and they have their own domestic priorities. Aging population means that they have 30, 40, 50% population that you have to finance in transportation, health system, and so on. They don't have kind of money that we need in developing countries to offset climate threat. But when it comes to us, then they're very suspicious that it's not being spent for the purposes that it's given. Partly because the countries are not transparent, partly because there is corruption, partly because there are other financial needs and pressures and imperatives. So the money is either floundered or spent on other things than the initial purpose. And in order to control that, they say we need to have transparent systems in place, which means more paperwork, which means more technically rigorous and robust papers, which means delayed financing, which means a pursuit of transparency also means more bureaucracy, more delayed access. So when it's more delayed access, that means you cannot reach out to the victims very properly. It also means barriers in spending, because there'll be a lot of paperwork to ensure there is transparency from the next round. So accessing international finance has become difficult for these reasons that I mentioned to you. And then there are other barriers a country has to cross, such as filling the application form, using the data that is reliable and robust and credible, defining your impact levels transparently that can be measured and that can be verified. Now, when you use such words like verification and transparency and all that, many developing countries would say that you're infringing on our sovereignty.
Even in this day and age where you have AI, they would actually say that?
Yes. Now, let me step back. This is the broad ecosystem with which international climate finance work. Then there are specialized institutions where one can access that finance, such as Green Climate Fund, such as Adaptation Fund, such as GEF. Each one of them has its own accreditation system, its own application processes, its own pipelines, its own priority areas, a developing country will need to have capacity and competence to pursue them. Know what your priorities are this year or the next year. And that is not always in sync with what you need at a given time. Our issues are very, very different at times. Because climate finance is a very large sum, we are talking billions and trillions of dollars. Multilateral development banks such as World Bank and ADB and others have also come into Paris Agreement compliant financing, which means it's climate smart. Whatever you do, we'll have the climate factors into our calculations. So what you call climate investment fund is not just coming from climate related funds, but it's also coming from
The other funds.
other funds also, which essentially means lending also. Sometimes concessional, but oftentimes not. Then beyond that, because the resources required are huge and the countries and societies are struggling with other innovations, such as public-private partnership, then comes in the private sector. Then you reach out to private sector to make investments for climate change on projects that may be infrastructural projects, but they have a role to play in climate resilience. So therefore, climate finance that you mentioned comes not only from climate finance windows such as Global Climate Green Climate Fund, but also of MDBs, multilateral development funds, but also from the private sector. In the private sector, let's say a private sector company is interested to help create, to invest in an infrastructural project that help reduce the travel time. And we said this reduction in travel time reduces your carbon emissions. So it becomes a climate smart project in a number of ways. So these are some of the complexities of the landscape.
Very interesting that, the private enterprises can also access this fund. What do you think are 3 barriers for the private sector at this moment in Pakistan?
In my humble view, the first barrier is Government of Pakistan. Government of Pakistan has elbowed private sector out. They don't know how to work with them. They'll convene a meeting, private sector will come, and the government at last minute will postpone the meeting. Or they'll not be able to issue the minutes for next 3 weeks or 3 months. And private sector is very conscious of time and efficiency of resources and all those things. And government's culture is very, very different. It's not just postponing the meeting. The government's procurement rules are impossible to comply with, or the private sector will not have the patience for that. Innovation. Private sector will look at different ways of cutting the costs, using the materials, and not necessarily going for the 3 quotation on the cheapest bidder. They look at the lifespan of the project and see what are the returns that we are getting. So these are 2 different worlds, so to speak. In a way, they coexist. But they coexist in there's a degree of animosity or suspicion perhaps. Most government people think private sector is about profit and profit is bad. So they'll dismiss the common ground that they may have with private sector. Profit may be bad, but profit excels innovation, it excels investment, it brings investment, it brings productivity and so on. But on the other side, the private sector will think government is corrupt, inefficient, the rules are very bureaucratic, very slow, it's a waste of time. And that is true. We have seen that a project that the private sector will pull off in a matter of months, it takes many years with the government. So that's one set. Then there are other subsets. Government is very confused, it doesn't know what its priorities are. You begin with something, there's a change in government, those priorities are buried before the private sector is fully engaged and it's become productive. I want to give you an example. I wrote the NDC, National Development Contributions. These are Pakistan's commitments that this is what we'll do. Now these commitments have several actions that can be undertaken by the private sector. But we have never gone and briefed the private sector this needs to be done. There are opportunities for the private sector to deliver climate smart projects. Example, if a school was damaged by the floods, Why is that government has to construct it? Why can't it be a private sector initiative? Private sector can spearhead innovation. They can leverage international investment.
But they're not interested. I mean, we've seen that private sector in Pakistan is not given much.
Private sector is interested in profit,
Which is not a bad thing.
which is not a bad thing, as I mentioned earlier. And the government looks at profit with suspicion. Private sector looks at speed with which they can get return on their investments. And that's why even Pakistanis will go to other countries to invest because they can do it rapidly. I was just talking this afternoon to someone in one of the Central Asian countries. And most of the investment in that country is coming from Pakistani's textile sector. Look at people 1,200 bought properties in UAE. 1,200 is not a small. Instead of trusting us, our institutions, banking institutions, governments and stock exchange and all that, a government could not win the trust of 1,200 investors. So I think the rot lies with the government. It has not been able to attract private sector. I want to give you one example for your listeners. Direct foreign investment is linked to many other things, and it has not picked up in this country. Whenever there's a government, we pick some new sectors to attract foreign investment. We range from oil refineries to IT to minerals to whatever. It keeps changing.
But they are also very clever in repatriating all the money out of the country.
Will do. It depends on the laws. Nobody will come here if the laws are not attractive for them. So visiting our laws and streamlining them and making them more transparent is our responsibility. But I just wanted to give you an example. So government of Pakistan shows very strong interest to attract investment, but is not able to protect the investment that is already in our country. From more than 120 companies that are members of OICCI, Overseas Investors Chamber of Commerce and Industry, many of them are bundling up. Many of them are not expanding, and many of them have worked in the country for decades. They know this society a lot more. If we can take care of them to keep their investments here, to expand their businesses, then they'll know how to attract others as well. So it's having a contempt for someone who is already here, if not contempt at least disregard, but then chasing the shadows elsewhere and going to international expos to attract people to do that. And then there are, of course, several other barriers. Workforce is not trained enough. Environment is not peaceful and predictable. Infrastructure is very weak. The flights are delayed. Public transportation is not available. Employees cannot come to office on time for whatever reasons. Electricity is not reliable. There's load shedding or something. So there's a long list of expectations that a private sector investor would have. And for the government, special economic zones such as under CPEC is nothing more than a real estate transaction. This is the plot size, this will be its value, and these are the roads and state lights we can give you. For everything else, there is no guidance. If we try to learn how China worked on special economic zones, then we'll know that it's more than real estate. But Pakistan has diminished its centrality in economic turnout.
What I think now is that our future is with the youth. And from our discussion, as you've pointed out, that our education system is not giving the right information for the youth to be able to become the decision makers or even take action which is beneficial towards our climate and third pole. What guidance can you give to the youth?
Youth bulge in the country is very dangerous. If we are not working to make it an asset, we are not giving skill set to our youth that are necessary for their careers or for sustainable development or for climate smart development. The way we are training people is that once you graduate, look for a job instead of becoming entrepreneurs and creating jobs for others also. The time period that we live is a time period of startups. It's a time period of AI. It's a time period of online deliveries, online trade, apps, and serving the society through app and yourself as well. So for millions and millions Pakistanis, I think the world has many opportunities and society needs to create some more opportunities here. Giving them an ecosystem where their startups could expand, consolidate, where they're not robbed of their investments and creativity. Second, mentoring for investments to look at their product proposals, their feasibilities for their investments. Typically, they're young kids. They may have bright ideas, but they need hand-holding. And that hand-holding does not necessarily mean you give them advice and then disappear. It means hand-holding, mentoring, giving them skill sets, giving them technical services, accounting services, banking, lending facilities, and then an ecosystem whereby you create partnership and consortia, where an investor comes, let's say, from an established company to say, okay, here's my equity of 10, 20, 30%. Here, a commercial bank says, with the support of Government of Pakistan, that this will be my investment to de-risk your project by a certain period. So we have to still create a big ecosystem. And then the sky is limit. Pakistani's youth is very talented. They do wonders in competitive and fair environments, and we need to provide that. The important thing is, ours is a very fragile country, and we have to give them an exposure to climate change-related threats to this society and to our economy, to our civilization, to our values. And that the range of actions in that area are immense. And we have not begun to even think about this, how to engage our youth in startups and new businesses and new enterprises in products and services that are climate smart. And if you could do that, the markets can be global. The interventions can be global. Their ability to become global will be much higher. The chances will be much higher.
I'm so glad that there is hope, a glimmer of hope, even though, I think this discussion has outlined so many important programs and reforms that are required still in Pakistan, whether be it governance or investment or climate change. And clearly, we need to see where our youth is going and how they can help. Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been extremely informative and an eye-opener for me.
My privilege, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Viewers, this has been a mind-blowing conversation for me, and I just hope you also take home some of these very important points, the points that we should consider from the historical perspective to our current educational curriculum problems, the governance problems, and many other constraints, even the barriers to avail Climate Investment Fund. I think this is a step forward when we open these discussions and we start to actually bring a discourse in this area. The government and the private sector must partner together. Only then the civil society will flourish and our Pakistan will flourish.